Now, anyone looking up at this glass from here would see a really interesting and kind of politically important program of imagery in these windows. And these are some of the ones that survive from that mid-13th century program. This is what people would have seen hovering over the high altar in the choir at that very eastern end of the building. So you can see the series of lancets. In each case, we have a set of two surmounted by a roundel. You see Christ's head and blessing hand poking up in the very top spandrel of this whole thing. But underneath, we see the really central characters and episodes in the Christian story brought together. The major saints, the apostles, who we also saw outside in that sculpture program, Peter and Paul, flanked the main set of windows. And these contain these images of, on the left-hand side, the Virgin Mary enthroned, seated as the throne of wisdom type we've encountered before, with the Christ child on her lap. She's wearing this purple royal robe and a crown on her head, fitting for this place where we also saw her being crowned on the exterior, and where inside, underneath this window, the kings and queens of France were also crowned in real life. Next to her, we see the central moment of Christ's passion, Christ on the cross, flanked by his mourning mother, Mary, and his friend, John the Evangelist. His blood is pouring from his feet into that golden chalice at the bottom in a reference to the Eucharistic celebrations or ceremonies that would be also conducted at the altar below. So the images tie into the key points of Christian theology, but then they also tie into the rituals performed at this place. And they tie into the place in an even more direct way when we look at the lower portions of these lancets, where under the Virgin Mary's throne, we find a little angel hovering over an arched opening with tracery inside, exactly the same kind of forms that we find throughout this building, a representation of the ecclesia, the church at Reims itself. And on the right-hand side, we find a standing bishop who is depicted in the same color garments as Mary and Christ above. He holds a big staff in his hand and has this clerical mitre on that indicates his episcopal or bishop's rank. So it makes him similar to Saint Remy outside. But this is actually a figure labeled as Archbishop Henry de Brenne, who is in charge of the building project in the 13th century as it's going up. So a very bold display of self-confidence on the part of the Reims clergy by aligning their church and their bishop with these central scenes of the Christian salvation story. And this idea of sort of the power of this particular building continues in some of the windows on the side walls of the choir, the upper side walls, where again we find depictions of the apostles over representations of the suffragan churches. They're all labeled. These are the churches that are under the authority of the Reims archbishop. They're depicted in the lower corners, and then other bishops of Reims are depicted on the right-hand side. So a program that's very self-referential, asserting the dominance of this church and its connection with the founding members of the Christian faith. Now, one of the things that, of course, you'll have noticed as I'm talking is how difficult it is to make out these figures. They're made of these small pieces of glass that are kind of soldered together within these grid-like frames. The important thing was less to be able to make out the details of the figures from the ground than to know that they were there. And that was the light shining through them that was illuminating the space that you were moving through. So it's a way of really creating this immersive environment for people who are walking through this church. And the main reason for creating that design with all of these spiky buttresses rising up is precisely to accommodate this kind of design that centers on windows and glass, and that allows the building to be saturated with this glowing imagery. A building this tall and those vaults inside of Reims Cathedral rise to 125 feet. Okay, the building this tall would seem to require really heavy walls to support it. But both the flexibility and relative lightness of the pointed arches, which bring a lot of the thrust of the vaults upward, but also these flying buttresses outside, which carry the thrust, in a sense, downward over these little bridge-like structures and into these very thick masonry supports at the bottom. These allow for the puncturing of the wall at that upper level. So the building basically has this exoskeleton that allows the wall surfaces inside to really dissolve into these configurations of really lightweight tracery and stained glass. But another way in which the interior and exterior are connected is through the imagery and the iconography of these windows. Because again, in the upper clerestory level, we find again and again depictions of church buildings with angels at the top, forming a kind of mediation between the earthly and the heavenly communities. And we also find that happening on the exterior of the building. In the buttresses, we find this whole row of angels up here that are framed by these same kind of openings and crowned by the same kind of triangular gables as in the windows. It's kind of like an angelic bodyguard for the building in three-dimensional space. Here, a slightly closer view of a couple of these. You can see on the right, the angel standing there. The one on the left I'm showing you just because a couple of years ago I was there and did the terrifying climb up into the upper roof level and got this images of the buttresses from above. Here, a view of the eastern end of the building, this choir area, the radiating chapels down below, and these double-decker tiers of flying buttresses, creating this incredible profile. And around the exterior of these radiating chapels, too, in between the windows, again, we find this kind of phalanx of angels. Here you see them a little bit more clearly, carrying liturgical censers and other implements of the same kind that the priests would be using for the liturgy inside the building. So in both the design and the iconography, we find these interconnections. Rows of kings line the upper level of the facade, and then we find the angels reappearing, as I've mentioned before, in the scene of the coronation of the Virgin. So the building as a whole really expresses this union of interior and exterior, a unity of parts, the balancing of horizontals and verticals, but then also continually reinforces a whole set of themes. Coronation imagery, royal imagery, so important for this church that was the coronation basilica. Images of angels guarding the place and forming this bridge between heaven and earth. And this regular reinforcements of the local history of the place through the images of the founding bishops, Saint Remy and Saint Nicaise, connecting them with the bishops who are presiding in the present. Okay, so we've moved from the upper reaches of the facade down through that gable level and then looking down at the three main portals, again with glass and tracery, replacing the more familiar carved tympana that would normally be there. It's really on the jambs leading into the openings of the doorways that we find lots of large-scale sculpted characters really animating our passage to the interior. Here in the center portal, there's the Virgin Mary at the very center on axis with the image of her coronation. And to her right, our left-hand side, we see figures enacting the presentation of the Christ child in the temple. But on the right-hand side, we find the scenes that lead into the story of the incarnation itself. One of the things I want to point out right away before we look at the figures actually is the area underneath their feet at the lower portion of the wall, which is actually close to eye level for where viewers are. What we're seeing here is something similar to what we found at the Sistine Chapel, a fictive curtain. The kind of thing that, again, would have been hung from these entryways on particularly important ceremonial processions All of the figures that we're looking at would have been brightly painted, but they lost all of their color many hundreds of years ago and now stand in these kind of bare monochrome surface appearance. But that certainly that fictive curtain carved into the lower level would have stood out very brightly too, as giving the church entryway a particular kind of pomp. So here we are looking at the right-hand jamb, narrative scenes that focus on Mary, who appears twice, kind of back to back, here and again here, focusing in on her role as Mother of God. On the left, you see the episode known as the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel, who stands closest to the door proper, speaks to Mary and tells her of her impending pregnancy. And on the right-hand side, the scene called the Visitation, which is where the expectant Virgin Mary meets up with her much older cousin, Elizabeth, who is miraculously pregnant with John the Baptist. You can see that they're all made in very different styles. The two figures on the right look quite different in terms of their faces, their gestures, as well as the kind of clothing that they wear from the ones on the left. And this testifies to the fact that there were multiple carvers and teams of people at work on this huge building over many years. And people of the time had no qualms about putting things made at slightly different times or by different workshops right next to each other. So it seems that the figures on the right-hand side were made like in the 1220s. The ones on the left-hand side were made a couple decades later. Variety was something that was highly prized here, as it was at other places in Byzantium and elsewhere. In any case, the two figures on the right are often lauded for their imitation of ancient Greek and Roman carving styles. The women's faces, their contrapposto stances, you can see the knees pressing out, the naturalism of their proportions, even again suggested beneath these layers of very bulky drapery, which you can really chart out and trace through the strong lines of these folds. A really similar drapery style to what we find in a lot of ancient Roman carvings. And this is very much in keeping with the admiration that we know 13th century academics had for ancient philosophical writings. The idea that classical antiquity was cool was not an invention of the Italian Renaissance, contrary to what Vasari would tell you. But this classicizing style was not something that stayed around for all that long in the art of the later Middle Ages. It was kind of a fad. And the sculptors, and presumably the approval of their patrons, tended to gravitate towards the style that you see embodied in the angel on the far left here. They keep the sense of naturalistic proportions and volumes of the body. They still give you the sense of contrapposto. You can trace the way that the angel is putting all of their weight onto one leg and gently swiveling their torso over. But the artists have kind of cleaned up the appearance of the drapery and made it look smoother, made it fall in more kind of supple, curving, almost bowl-like folds. So giving, in a sense, more attention to the body and less to the clothing. We see this as well in this oblique image where you can see here the face of the Virgin kind of looking out toward us and the face of the angel turning both toward Mary to give her the happy news of her pregnancy, but also again toward us as if to welcome us into the church. And it's this face that really is a kind of hallmark, again, of Gothic carving. Forget about the stereotypes about the dreary and dismal and serious Dark Ages. The 13th century, the age of the Gothic cathedrals, the age of the vernacular poems and so forth, is a time of great inventiveness and experimentation in the depiction both of bodies but also of faces in different emotional states. And we see this here in the way that the angel's face responds to what seems to be an internal movement. So the face of the figure is given these very delicate features. The lips pull back very slightly. They actually reveal, you can't quite see it in here, but they reveal a little glimpse of the angel's teeth. As the lips pull back, they push the cheeks upward so that they create these little sort of pockets underneath the eyes and make the eyes crinkle upward at the edges. This is a very organic conception of the human face in which an interior psychological or emotional movement activates the muscles of the face, and the flesh then responds to that. So a new kind of psychological presence is added to these figures who already have this extremely strong physical presence and corporeality. The sacred is really rendered in very material and very humanized form here. Now, that angel I've just been talking about actually has a companion on another one of the portals, and you're seeing that here on the right-hand slide. And our smiling angel here accompanies this other classicizing angel in flanking the martyr saint. It's either Saint Denis or Saint Denis, who was the patron of another nearby, very important nearby church where the French kings were buried. It could also represent Saint Nicaise. I'm just going to say that it represents Denis. In any case, they're placed on the left-hand jamb of the left-hand portal of the west facade. Here, this is a good image for showing you scale. Look at the person, kind of average size adult, who is walking around in front of these. These are enormous figures. We've all had bad hair days, but poor St. Denis is having a bad head day. Like Saint Nicaise, the founder of the bishopric, he was beheaded by the pagans, but here, instead of being a cephalophore, sort of carrying his entire head, he's just had the top part of his cranium sliced off. So he may have been carrying that in his hands, as we see happening in this manuscript image from the 1280s. But even though Saint Denis looks pretty sad and downtrodden, the angels are both quite happy, and particularly this one on the right-hand side. This smiling angel is by far the most famous piece of art attached to this building. It's become the emblem of the cathedral itself and even of the city. And you see them here represented in stamps and champagne bottle labels. Reims is in the region of Champagne, by the way, so this is where you can get some really good beverages as well. They've been on coins, etc. And on t-shirts, of course, as Klaus has been enlisted to show you. This is not just because the angel is so zesty and cute, but it has to do with the church's story in the 20th century, believe it or not. The building had been through a lot between the time of its completion, first in the 1280s with, again, these intermittent kind of updates to the upper levels into the 15th century. There's been a lot that's happened at this church between then and the 20th century. Apart from being the place where the French kings were crowned in continuous line, using the same oil that heavenly dove had brought at the baptism of King Clovis, it was also the place where Joan of Arc famously helped to kind of rally the French troops and oust the English army in the 100 Years' War of 1429. At the center, you're seeing a painting of King Charles being crowned with Joan of Arc looking on, a 19th century fantastic rendition of this actual historical event. And in the lower right-hand corner, you're seeing a commemorative plate from the final coronation that took place here in 1825. The building stayed Catholic throughout the tumultuous early modern period, but in the 1790s, during the years of the French Revolution, it was secularized and turned into a temple of reason. A lot of the sculptures were retained, which is kind of surprising, but you see on the lintel over the Virgin's head in the central portal the inscription that was added at this time. In the 19th century, the building returned to use as a church and underwent some renovation work and conservation. And as an art historical monument, it was admired as evidence of the grandeur and ingenuity of the French in their medieval history, but it wasn't especially cherished for its aesthetic power. It didn't really fit the models of classical beauty that educated people prized through the 19th century. But in the first quarter of the 20th century, as World War I pitted neighboring European countries against each other, things took a really terrible turn at Reims. Starting in September 1914 and continuing on for the next couple of years, the Germans began shelling Reims Cathedral, leading to a series of devastating fires, the ultimate collapse of the roof, and devastation, particularly to the northern tower and portal. You're seeing here some of the photographs that were publicized after these, during and after these events. Here, the upper portion of the roof completely burned out and collapsed. A view inside the choir area where you see lots of that glass that's been knocked out and the huge pile of rubble from the vault overhead, and paintings as well as photographs, commemorated the terrors of this event and what a criminal act it was for the Germans to have defied international law by targeting a place of such incredible cultural heritage. And, there was immediate and very intense outrage, both on the part of the French, but also abroad. And we get this whole kind of big propaganda campaign where the German army and leaders are rendered as these kind of barbaric destroyers of culture, going back to this whole idea of like the Goths. Here we really have these depictions of these kind of Nordic monsters destroying this symbol of intelligence and refinement and artistry here, particularly disturbing one from the US, trying to get people, young men, to enlist in the effort to go fight overseas. Now, this is the same kind of imagery and language that the 5th century BC Greeks used for the Persians after the Persians had come in and destroyed that earlier iteration of the Parthenon. And you may remember that at that time, too, the impetus was to leave the Parthenon building as rubble, remember, and not rebuild it. That same argument was actually made for the Cathedral of Reims as well. There were, in fact, American art historians who said, just, leave it as it is in its damaged form, as a kind of permanent accusation and recrimination against these forces of barbarity and destruction. Part of the building that played a really important role in all of this was that angel, because as you can see in this newspaper photo, the North Tower that stood over that portal was one of the first things to be very damaged. St. Nicaise is still actually in pretty much the same condition. He already lost his head, according to the story. But here we find that smiling angel, again, devastatingly headless, and both figures showing a lot of damage on their lower bodies as well. But when the head of the smiling angel appeared almost miraculously among the rubble, it seemed to shine forth with its little smile as testimony to the pride and optimism and endurance of this kind of French spirit animating the building, and indeed to the spirit of creativity and intellect and heart that is not just a French trait, but a human trait. And so money poured in from all over Europe as well as America to reconstruct Reims Cathedral. And this was a project that was undertaken pretty much as soon as World War I was over and all through the 1920s, and the building was able to reopen with great fanfare in 1938. Here you see some of the major benefactors of that project standing in front of the newly rebuilt portals of this building upon its grand reopening. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who at the same time was investing money in the construction of the Cloisters Museum in Upper Manhattan as the first American museum to focus on medieval European art. That was open in 1938, the same year as the newly renovated cathedral. Rockefeller put over $1 million, a huge sum at that time as now, into the renovation of this building. And this included the construction of steel beams over the vaults at the upper level so that they would not burn the way that the wooden rafters did. This is what happened also at Notre Dame in Paris, which I'll talk about a little bit next time. In any case, and here eventually in the 1960s, the Germans were included in this show of unity as well. Here you're seeing the leaders of France and Germany, a couple generations after the Great War and well after World War II, gathering for reconciliation within Reims Cathedral. So today, when we visit the building, and all of the images that we've been looking at are really of this reconstructed cathedral that had gone through so much in its previous life, including in very recent history. And the building is a symbol now, not just of Christian confidence and French royal authority and artistic ingenuity as it had been in the 13th century. And it's not just a symbol of French national pride either, as it had been in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it's really become this symbol of peace and creativity and constructiveness and international cooperation over destruction and conflict, the assertion of shared values through cooperative rebuilding. It's also, an embodiment of the awesomeness of Gothic architecture, but that's a story for another class.